Thank you all for joining. My name is Phoebe Glemba, and welcome to another JCG webinar. In today's webinar, we will be kicking off the year with starting 2020 off on the right foot, led by our senior business consultant, Lawrence W. Michael. If you have a question while we go through the presentation, please feel free to type it into the chat box, and we will address it at the end of the webinar. Larry, thanks so much for taking the time to chat and give us some tips as we get further into 2020. Go ahead and take it away.
Thanks, Phoebe. Well, greetings, and thanks for taking time out of your busy days to focus on opportunities for continuous improvement within your funeral home or cemetery as we start off 2020. And as our title says, trying to get started off on the right foot. You really are to be commended for investing your time. And what I always like to describe this as playing offense. Often throughout the day, as we're serving families and running our company, we're really kind of playing defense, right? But this time together that you've set aside is really an opportunity to pause and kind of consider ways to grow in this, ever-changing competitive market. Consider this point here, this quote I'm going to read to you. Without a plan and a strategy, we will not arrive at our desired destination, right? And this reminds me of of a business writer by the name of James Clear, when he talks about how businesses and individuals can gradually slide out of first place by simply and quite innocently repeating day after day just 1% errors, by replicating poor decisions or duplicating tiny mistakes, or by even rationalizing little excuses. In both our personal and our business lives, the small choices we make each day can compound into either amazing measurable results or potentially toxic results. This can all be demonstrated by the analogy of an aircraft. So let's imagine an aircraft is going to shift its heading by only a few degrees. So for example, if we were going to fly from Los Angeles to New York, and if the pilot of the aircraft leaving LAX adjusts the heading of our aircraft by just 3 degrees, the plane would actually arrive in Washington, D.C. instead of our original destination of New York City, which is 225 miles off course, if you can believe it, right? And just by an insignificant 3-degree shift in our heading. Well, such a small change, only 3 degrees, is barely noticeable, right? Maybe a shift of 7 feet from the aircraft nose when they left LAX. Yet a small shift in direction can lead to a very meaningful change in your destination. And like the plane analogy, a positive or negative shift in our daily and individual and collective practices at your funeral home or cemetery will make a significant impact on your destination. So making a choice that's 1% better or 1% worse may seem insignificant in the moment. However, over a period of time, these choices will determine who we are and who we really could be. It's our goal at Johnson Consulting that today's webinar will help you to sharpen your saws, if you will, to recalibrate, maybe refocus, and to appropriately challenge yourself to strive every day to make a 1% improvement in your company as we kick off 2020. At Johnson, we really see that in operating a funeral home or cemetery that there's 4 key areas of focus that always have to be prevalent for you as leaders. And these 4 pillars really are: number 1, achieving unprecedented levels of customer service and making sure that satisfaction is at the highest levels possible. The second would be providing an optimum workplace environment, right? And we'll talk about that in a few minutes, but communication, there's so many things that need to be optimum. We spend so much time of our lives at work, and especially in this profession, right, where it's not an 8-to-5 job. We also want to see as another pillar the importance of strengthening our position in the marketplace. Competition continues to be aggressive, right? Cremation rate keeps doing what it does in the way of growth in most markets, but we always have to work hard to strengthen our position in the marketplace. And then finally, our final pillar of a successful management of your company would be maximizing your financial performance, right? Making sure we're improving the operating performance and ultimately improving your enterprise value of your company. So today I'm going to just touch on each of these 4 areas. I really can't do all of them great justice, but I want to just give you some thoughts about each one of them to challenge you to think about how you make that 1% improvement on a daily basis at your own business. So let's jump into customer service. And as we do that, I'm going to play you a short video that really sets the tone for reminding us that our marketplace has changed, our consumer has changed. So sit back and enjoy this video for a moment, and then we'll continue on.
Did you hear that? That's the balance of power changing. We are your neighbors, your brothers and sisters, co-workers, kids, your grandmothers. We're the driver sitting at the red light next to you, the other passengers on the plane. And now we have the power. It used to be Madison Avenue, census data, focus groups, secret shoppers. It used to be jingles, endorsements, infomercials, coupons. It used to be, the customer is always right, said those who didn't listen. But that was yesterday. Today we found our voice. We are strangers, but we are organized. We won't wait for your big data. We want whatever, whenever, wherever. 9 to 5. We live 24 hours a day. We are a moving target. We move fast. We are a movement. We are cutting cords, changing the way things work. Status quo, status no. We brought down the taxi industry, but we are not the enemy. We are your opportunity. We are growing, getting better at getting better. We are your path to success, if you can keep up with us. We'll be on the winning team because we'll pick the winners. We are not millennials. We are families with more Facebook followers than you. We are not baby boomers. We are grandmothers who order Christmas gifts from a touchscreen. Gen X. Gen Y? No. We are Generation CX. And you can be too, if you listen to us. Create for us. Join us. Generation CX.
The reason I played that video as we talk about customer service is clearly in the funeral and cemetery profession, there is really no doubt that our customer is changing, right? Working in the cemetery and funeral profession for over 30 years, I've, in my own firsthand account, have seen this happen. It's dramatically different. So for us to really create these better customer experiences, we really have to understand our customers. We need to understand what they want and how they think, and we really have to compel ourselves to remain relevant. The way we served a family in our funeral home or cemetery, even as recently as 3 to 5 years ago, may not be what we need to be doing today if we want to remain the market leader and provide the highest levels of customer service. So customer service obviously is our number one job, right? You know, we have to provide that exceptional customer service. It's paramount, right? I mean, we have to make that happen every time. And it's our greatest competitive advantage. As you think about world-class companies, clearly customer service is tremendous, and that's why they're considered world-class. And it's really, at the end of the day, it's the reason you work here, right? It's the reason you felt compelled to get into the funeral or cemetery profession. So we need to keep that in mind. But there's a challenging aspect to this, is it's something that we call service aptitude. And what service aptitude is, really, it's a person's ability to recognize opportunities to exceed a customer's expectations, regardless of the circumstances. So here's the challenge, though. There's a term that we like to call service aptitude scarcity, because really nobody's born with it, right? It's just not innate in us. You know, the vast majority of the workforce has extremely low service aptitude, especially when they're entering the workforce, maybe after finishing school, whether it's getting out of mortuary college or getting out of some other, college or high school degree. And so a result of poor training, and sometimes even us being paranoid as management, the high service aptitudes that you really need are difficult to achieve. So it's really important for us to recognize that. And then there's 3 things, if you think about it, that really shape everybody's service aptitude. Okay, what that means to me compared to each of you that's attending this webinar. Number 1, it's our life experiences, right? It's a huge factor, especially for people that are younger entering the workforce. Think about your home environment, your groups of friends, what your experiences were growing up. Sometimes our frontline employees haven't had some of those experiences yet. Maybe they haven't flown first class, haven't been able to go to a 5-star, resort or whatnot, right? And so their life experience of what exceptional customer service is defined just by what they've experienced thus far. Then we have other impacts, such as your past work experience, right? Think about how small the percentage of the organizations that are truly world-class in customer service. So often you're hiring and bringing somebody onto your company who maybe didn't work at a company that had such high expectations for customer service. So they weren't necessarily trained, right, on what excellent service looks like. So it's important to consider that. And then finally, your current work experience. What is happening today, right now, in your funeral home and cemetery? You know, is it the customer first philosophy? You know, and really, what kind of training do you have in place? And so we have to recognize that you may have a staff of 3 or 300, that everybody on your team has a little different perception unless you as the leader have really defined what excellent customer service needs to look like. So with customer service, we find it's very important, we believe this at Johnson Consulting, to develop a customer service vision statement. Really, so you have a mantra. This isn't a mission statement that goes on your website, okay? This is more of an internal, mantra, if you will. And what it is it represents the purpose of your company's existence. This is the heart of what's at your core and why you even exist. And it's what each member of your team does as they deliver customer service. And I'll unpack this concept a little bit more here in a moment. First, let me read a quote by an incredible author all of us, I'm sure, have heard of, Ken Blanchard. He says, the only thing your competition can't take away from you is the relationship your people have with your customers. You think about that. That's powerful, right? Everyone in your organization can make a difference in your customers' lives. The memories you create will keep people coming back and bringing their friends for years to come. Now, clearly, Ken didn't write this about the funeral and cemetery profession, because who wants to bring their friends to a funeral home, right? But the point is, customer loyalty, referring friends and family to your firm, is really what you're after. You want to create that experience that makes them think of no other provider in their community other than your firm. I want to show you some examples of customer service vision statements that we've helped some of our clients across North America develop, just so you can kind of understand this. Here's one: caregivers of our community, honoring every family's story. And if you think about it, that firm really is passionate that, hey, we are caregivers. We are very connected to our community. We believe in what the word honoring means, and every single family has a different story. So that's what their entire team is focused on every day as they serve family. Here's another one: guiding families with compassion and care, or create compassionate moments. Just think about that concept. If you create those little moments along the way, you will absolutely deliver incredible customer service. And the last example I have here is impacting families to begin healing. So these vision statements, they apply to every employee in the organization, right? It could be obviously your full-time arrangers, your family service counselors, but it applies to your part-time staff, your embalmers, your removal team. Everybody contributes to incredible customer service. Johnson Consulting, we provide surveys for funeral homes and cemeteries, and I wanted to show you this one statistic, is that almost half of every family that comes in contact with your funeral home or cemetery says that the reason they selected you is you took care of them before. And what this tells me is it underscores how important it is that to continuously and every time deliver the highest level of service possible. If you begin to slip a little bit, they attend another funeral at a funeral home down the street, or go to a cemetery down the street, you put your company a little bit at risk, right, for retaining that customer loyalty. So you create a customer service vision statement. So we have this mantra, you talk about it, you keep it alive in front of your staff, but how do you deliver on it, right? We recommend that you want to develop these supporting pillars, right? This is how all the employees perform and interact with your customers on a daily basis. So we want to help them with that. And I'll give you an example. So for example, we would want to be relevant. We want to make sure our team always remembers to be relevant, that we need to understand our customer, educate them. That's our job, right? To let them know all their options and then ultimately deliver on the service. We want to be present, right? Owning every moment and just being sure that we don't get distracted, that we don't let our personal lives or the stress that we're super busy right now distract us. Always being present is a way that we can deliver excellent service and then ultimately be amazing. How do you deliver the unexpected? How do you do something different that really has an aha moment in that family's lives? And if the whole team is always rallying around that concept, you'd be amazed, no pun intended, of how easy and fun it is to do a little special thing to be amazing. So excellent customer service, the one final thing that you really need to do is you need to develop your service standards, right? All world-class companies I talked about before, if you think about the Amazons, the Zappos, the Starbucks, the Ritz-Carltons, the Disneys, right? They do three things that are better than anybody else, and that's why they're so good. First of all, the leaders are obsessed with the company's customer experience. Okay, so there's no doubt that leadership is obsessed. They make sure every employee walks in the shoes of the customer. And I would say in our profession, we're probably a little better at this than most. I think we're compassionate, we have a lot of empathy, but we're human, right? And so we need to remind our staff every morning, hey, we've got to be sensitive to who's walking in those front doors. And these companies, what they do is they define what service standards need to be. They create, if I owned a funeral home or a cemetery tomorrow, they create what I like to call the Michael way, that this is the way we do it. It's so important, and we go back to those earlier concepts of service aptitude, that we must define what we expect. Otherwise, how do we expect our employees to all deliver at the same highest level? And along the way, you want to identify those above and beyond practices, because you want to coach and help and mentor your team to come up with those aha moments, those amazing moments. And you also want to recognize sometimes we have defects. Sometimes things get in the way and they ruin the customer experience. Okay, what do we do? How do we handle that? So when we work with clients, and what we recommend that you do when you define your service standards, think of it in the context of the stages of interaction with the customer. So I'll start with a funeral home. You have that initial contact. Are we consistent with how we answer the phone, how we greet families, how we seat families, things like that, right? What's our process for bringing that loved one into our care? Are there aha moments? Are there little amazing touches that we can do, especially when we go into the home? In that arrangement conference, what do we expect every arranger to do and say? I mean, there should be some certain standards that are clear that every family will experience when they come to your funeral home. Another stage is going to be the gathering, right? That might be the visitation, the viewing, the wake. What do we expect there? The ceremony, we need to define that. How early should we be set up? What do we expect to do? How do we wrap things up and dismiss? The final rest, which often might be at a cemetery, what does that look like? What do we expect? How is that going to be delivered? And then finally, your continuing care program. And so what we recommend is that you look at each of these 7 touch points and create very clear standards of what you expect your team to do. Similarly, on the cemetery side, you have, and I'll kind of go through these quickly, but you certainly have the initial contact. You have the arrangement conference. A preemie turning at need, especially on the cemetery side, is a very different experience. And so you have to be sure that you're very clear with your team as to what you expect, everything from the park tour to how the process needs to work. Cemeteries need to do interment verification. It needs to be very clear as to what everybody's role is. What does that committal service look like? And when you have things set up, the final rest, often the family wants to witness, maybe the public wants to be there for the lowering or for the placement in the crypt. And so what's your cemetery standards? Memorial placement, that's a huge opportunity to be a hero, and it's also a huge risk to have a challenge, right? And what do you have defined there to be sure that process is smooth? And then finally, continuing care. And I want to show you on the next slide, this is just an example of something that we've done with our clients at Johnson Consulting, is we take each of those stages. So I just took ceremony as an example, and you'll see here in the middle, we set that quote unquote Michael way, that this is the way we expect a service to be run, and we kind of outline it. And then you use that to train your staff. At the same time, you look over here at the above and beyonds. Not everybody will think about, oh, it'd be nice to, for example, rope off a certain area to kind of have the seating kind of fall into place a certain way. And so sometimes you need to remind your staff of things that they can do to go above and beyond. And the service defects, it's not to be a Debbie Downer here, but hey, this is reality, right? Sometimes we have some challenges. Let's acknowledge that, and let's continuously strive to find ways to prevent those from happening. And if they do happen, how do we react? So customer service is our first big pillar that you, as you kick off 2020, want to think about, what can I do just to ratchet that up a little bit, be 1% better on a daily basis? The other pillar that we discussed is workplace. Again, we have to have that optimum workplace environment. And I'm going to touch on a couple key ways I believe you can do this. I promise I won't play too many more videos other than this next one, but I always enjoy this one to kind of set the tone and talk about what we expect in the workplace.
First tattoo?
Yeah.
Relax, amigo. It's gonna look okay.
Only okay?
No worries, boss. I'm one of the tattoo artists in the city.
You mean one of the best tattoo artists in the city, right?
Something like that. Yeah.
Aren't you supposed to draw it first?
Stay in your lane, bro.
Just okay is not okay, especially when it comes to your network.
I always get a chuckle out of that, right? In your workplace, is everything just okay? And if you sit there and you're honest with yourself and you know that there's some relationship challenges, some communication hiccups, that there's this and that going on, you want to challenge yourself and say, hey, how do I make my workplace environment exceptional, optimal, right? You don't want to have the mentality of, stay in your lane, like this guy says, right? Well, that's not my job. That's not what I'm asked to do. How do you create that and foster that teamwork and that environment that you want to have in your workplace?
First,
So you're trying to develop this best in class in your workplace, right? You want to have these active, engaged employees in a positive environment, right? And you want to foster growth. Most of us on this call have probably read the books that say, listen, the number one reason for leaving a company is not compensation. It's the leader that they work for, right? And that environment hasn't been positive. It hasn't fostered their excitement about how to grow and expand their career. So I see, again, we won't have time to go into all kinds of areas within the workplace, but let me touch on two that I think are very important. One is effective communication. And then the other I like to call career-long coaching sessions with each one of your employees. And let me kind of talk you through each of those here for a moment. Within effective communication, you really have to be committed to have structured communication. And examples that I would recommend based on this is, for example, have a daily morning huddle, and don't give yourself the excuse that we're too busy, or we have 7 rooftops, or the grounds guys start at 7 a.m. Figure out a way to do it. And in my career, I've seen not only firms I've been a part of, but firms that we work with at Johnson, it can happen. It can make a huge, huge difference. You call the play for the day, you double check, the details are being met. You also, when you think about communication as a leader, you want to sit down with your key players, your key principals every week. That might be a partner, manager, department heads, and just circle the wagons. If you're at a large combo, you want your grounds and your sales and your admin, your GM, maybe the funeral home manager. If you're just at a funeral home, maybe you've got an evening kind of staff member, and you've got kind of your back room embalming staff. You have your front, you want to think about how do you get those folks together, and let's just vet out what's going on. Let's make sure we don't have silos and that we're all communicating. What we really need to all be doing is committing to regular staff meetings. And again, whatever that frequency looks like to you, if you're sitting here right now listening and thinking, boy, I haven't had a staff meeting and I can't remember when, I just want to challenge you. I would recommend, regardless of how big or small you are, you at least do it once a month. I guess you could go every 2 months, but you want to get the team together, and yes, you may need to go through some administrative things, like don't forget to turn your time cards in at a certain day and time, but you also want to talk about where's the company going, and just give the staff an opportunity to really contribute and be a part of and understand where the company's headed. And be consistent. When you kick these off, if you tell everybody you're going to do them every month, do them every month. Find a way to get them done. If you're going to be personally unavailable, vacation, sick, have somebody step in for you, and share the responsibility based on my comment of having somebody step in for you, right? Have others get involved and facilitate those meetings. And I can promise you the benefits are huge. Anytime that we at Johnson Consulting, or in my prior career running funeral homes and cemeteries, when there's been a challenge, when I dive in and really start to unpack what's going on, it almost always comes back to poor communication, lack of staff meetings. So again, I would really challenge yourself to do that. And when you establish meetings, and I can certainly be happy to talk with any of you after the call, I recommend at Johnson, we all do this format of what we call RPI. Focus on the results first. What's happened, what have we accomplished? You might be talking about customer service scores, you might be talking about call volume or pre-need sales revenues, just kind of high level, progress. What are we working on right now? What's coming up down the line? We're going to do a big hospice training session. We're already teeing up the clergy breakfast for this fall. What are we working on? And then issues. What's getting in our way? What's preventing us from really being wildly successful? And if you use that format, these staff meetings can flow very, very nicely. I always recommend with kind of ending on a high note, something very motivational, maybe a short video clip or a great quote, maybe even a comment that a customer wrote in on on a survey or a thank you card. The other way that you can optimize the workplace is, as I mentioned before, this career-long counseling session, if you will, this coaching session. You're compelled and you need to really conduct annual performance evaluations. You're doing your team a disservice, and you're probably pushing them to be disengaged, and you're at risk for losing them if you're not sitting down with them. And as I put on the slide here, yes, full-time, that's kind of obvious, right? But don't forget about your part-time staff. In the funeral and the cemetery profession, we really, really rely on part-time staff. They have feelings too, right? They make a huge impact, and sales, admin, grounds, everybody. If that's too many people, spread it out. You don't have to do them all in January, right? Just do 3 a month. I mean, there's so many ways that you could tackle this. You might, in my second bullet point, you might consider, maybe more frequently for your key team members. Maybe that's management, maybe that's an arranger or a sales counselor, because you really want to be coaching them on performance and the expectations that you set out there. So I can't implore you enough to have annual performance evaluations. Now, if you're thinking to yourself, I don't want to have them because we had a bad year and I can't really afford to give out much, if any, in the way of raises. Well, one suggestion is do it at different times during the year. Do your annual performance evaluation, say, for example, in January, and then have a separate discussion in July to discuss merit increases. I mean, so there's ways to kind of work through that so that you're not avoiding having these performance evaluations. I love this quote here, and you may have to read it twice with me to really let it sink in. There's no greater unequal than the equal treatment of unequals. So think about that. There's no greater unequal than the equal treatment of unequals. Listen, funeral home and cemetery owners are often just great men and women, caring, nice, compassionate, accommodating, generous, right? Guys, giving all your staff members the same raise, 3%, 4%, whatever, across the board, that's old school. I mean, that isn't a progressive way. That's not a way to develop your team and grow your company. In today's competitive environment, you're really implored to reward those employees who are your top performers, the ones that who are driving your call volume or your pre-need sales in the cemetery. And you're also implored to address those who don't deliver the same levels, right? And it might be time to make some tough choices. It's hard, right? But sometimes you do have to address that. And you may need to invite somebody on your team to select a career outside of your company, which I say that with a little tongue in cheek, but that is reality. You don't want to be burdened with having anybody but a top performer on you. And speaking of that, Einstein says, stay away from negative people. They have a problem for every solution, right? So if you are listening to this webinar and you're thinking, oh my gosh, I do have so-and-so, challenge yourself, right? Confront that issue and address it. The third pillar that we're going to touch on, again, won't be able to do it a lot of justice, but I just want to kind of, give you some thoughts as you kick off 2020, is the marketplace. And one of the first things that always comes to mind for me about the marketplace is the power of pre-need. Pre-need really is doing what? It's securing your future market share, right? And as you think about pre-need, here's some things that I certainly recommend that you think through. Number one, have sales targets. And this may sound kind of elementary or simple, but it's very common for funeral homes and cemeteries to just say, well, we're trying to do well. Put a number down, right? Because winners keep score, right? And so if you did $1 million in pre-need funeral last year, challenge yourself, challenge your pre-need group. I want to do $1.1 million or whatever that growth needs to be. And then look at it, whether you have that big annual number you're chasing or you want to measure it quarterly or monthly, and then ultimately celebrate the wins, right? I mean, you want to really push this very hard. And as you listen to this call and you think about 2020, you want to ask yourself, how effective is my pre-need program? Am I simply writing pre-needs that when they kind of quote unquote fall in my lap, Mrs. Smith comes in, I want to get things taken care of from my parents that just got admitted into a convalescent nursing home. They say it's a good idea, and so here we are. We all write those pre-needs, right? But you should really challenge yourself. What's your ratio of new pre-need contracts being written compared to those pre-needs that turn at need, right? And if you're not writing at least more than those, you're almost promising yourself that your call volume, your pre-need turning at need, and the cemetery side as well, is your internals are going to decline over time, right? So you want to think about what those ratios look like. If you're like me, hey, we're all worried about cremation rate, right? And what that's doing to our average sale. We could also have the concern of we might lose a key staff member that's got great ties into the community, who has quote unquote a following, or people that really come to your firm because of them. All these are reasons why you want to have a strategy. You want to have a plan that really drives pre-need. Pre-need is the one thing you can absolutely control in your funeral home and cemetery. At need, you can work very, very hard. You can impact it. You can hang on to and grow market share, absolutely. But pre-need, you can really, you can make a big impact there. As you think about lead programs, some of these they're not new. Direct mail can still be very effective. Every market's a little different, so that's not an absolute everywhere in the country, but it certainly can work, and you can get some nice returns. A big one that we continue to see that's very, very effective is seminars. Getting folks together, maybe you feed them a light meal, talking to them about the benefits of pre-planning, maybe you even highlight what their veteran benefits are. But that's an excellent way to develop leads for your pre-need team. And then ultimately, digital marketing. It's a whole world now that, I'll admit, even though I use my smartphone and I get on Facebook now and then, that's a whole different world. And there are incredibly successful programs that digitally can help you generate leads and help you grow. So remember, pre-need, it needs to be a top priority for you. You should be thinking about it every day you come into the funeral home or cemetery. You also then want to create a marketing plan for your community outreach. Now, that may kind of go without saying. I mean, in the funeral and cemetery profession, we get it. We need to be involved in the community and so forth. But at Johnson, we would challenge you to make a plan, write it down, and have it be specific by month, by quarter. And think about things like, hey, where's my competitor getting calls or pre-need cemetery sales from us that we're not getting? Sit back and don't do this in a silo behind your desk by yourself. Make this a topic at your staff meeting. Your staff often has a great read on what's really happening with the families in your community. So identify where you're losing an opportunity, and then maybe just choose 2 or 3 what I like to call key influencers, people that can make an impact on whether you get a call or not. Don't make a list of here's 15 churches or here's 10 hospice agencies or 5 hospitals. You've just overwhelmed yourself and your staff, and you won't be effective. Just pick 2 or 3, and then leverage your team, right? You yourself, those of you that are listening, I mean, you don't have enough hours in the day. I mean, sure, you're going to be involved with some of this, but delegate. Figure out who has an interest, who wants to be plugged in, and it can be very simple. I'll give you this quick story. I had a gentleman run a funeral home for me in West LA, actually more in the San Fernando Valley. Very, very competitive market. Lots of funeral homes, lots of cremation societies. We were a full traditional funeral home, and his call volume in 1 year jumped nearly 20%. It was huge. He was up like 60 some odd calls. And of course, I'm celebrating the victories along the way. And I sit down with him one day over lunch, and I said, Ray, what are you doing? I mean, how are you getting this kind of growth? We didn't change prices. We didn't necessarily advertise very much more. Nothing really remarkable happened. And he said, Larry, here's what I've done. He says, I started to track where I was getting my calls, and I realized that there were 4 nursing homes in my backyard that I rarely got a call from. And he said, you and I know that there's folks that pass away there. And so I challenged myself. And so this is a really simple story, and I've told lots of folks about this over the years, is he just went out and bought a bunch of clear glass jars, put a sticker with the name of his funeral home on it, and then filled it up with candy. And he went to those 4 convalescent homes, and he just visited with the nurses, and he put a candy jar at every nurse's station, probably put one on the social director's desk or the executive director as well, right? And then he said, the beauty of it is, he said, I had a reason to stop back by. So if it was February, he'd pop in with a bunch of Valentine's type candy. If it was, March or April, he might do some Easter stuff, and you get the idea. And he could distinctly track his growth out of those nursing homes, because what? They were key influencers, right? Often the family's looking to those nurses who almost are extended family members, right? And they're recommending his funeral home. So there's all kinds of programs like that that can be very, very simple, but can make a huge impact. And as you can hear from that example, not even really all that expensive. to invest in. And then finally, let's get to the fourth pillar, which is financial. This is where it all happens, right? At the end of the day, we want to try to grow our revenues, be smart about our expenses and drive profits so that we can improve our enterprise value, what our company's worth. And there's a few things I'll hit on here. Of course, we can't get into everything during a short meeting like this. But number one, we're huge believers in budgeting. You really think of it like charting out a plan, right? You want to be comprehensive about it. At a minimum, I would do a revenue budget, but we would still certainly recommend that you budget your expenses. We get it, things happen, death rate goes up or down, a pre-need sales counselor comes or goes, and so there's things that kind of impact your revenues. Expenses, unknowns happen, the roof gets damaged in a storm. I mean, we get it, but at least you have a plan, and you can compare your performance against what you budgeted for the year, as well as how you performed last year, and you might even look back the last couple of years. It's not too late. I mean, it's only the 22nd of January. A lot of clients are just now kind of wrapping up their budgets and getting them in place. So put a budget together. And then what I would say is almost more important than the budget, I mean, you certainly want to have it, is review your performance every month and put an action plan together to either keep that trajectory or make corrective action. If you go a month or two, or even more scary, 3 or 4 months, and you're not looking at your financial performance, to be honest with you, you're kind of like flying an airplane blindfolded, right? Or you're managing your firm with one arm tied behind your back. And in fact, I've got that comment on here. You need to be looking at that because things can creep. Remember my opening comments about 1%, right? Let's say your labor expense just starts creeping at 1%. And we all know that labor is our highest cost of operating a funeral home and cemetery. If that begins to creep on you 1%, by the time you get to the end of the year, you've got a huge, expense growth item that may have really hurt your opportunity to achieve the profits you were trying to deliver. So, don't fly blindfolded. And as you look at your performance, you may find that there's ways that you can address and improve, things and make some key decisions. Cash flow is important too. We can look at a beautiful P&L statement. Revenues are doing this. Expenses are all normal. Profits look great. But guess what? If we're not bringing the money in, game over, right? So, study that. Do you have challenges by one or more specific arrangers or family service counselors? Do you need to do training? So don't take your eye off the accounts receivable ball. Nobody likes it, right? I mean, the last thing we want to do is run an AR report and study it and see that Mrs. Smith owes us $300 because the obituary cost more, or so-and-so called in and ordered a vase to be added to the cemetery grounds and we forgot to put it on a contract or bill them. Nobody likes that. I get it. It's not exciting, but you certainly can't take your eye off that ball. You have to be diligent. You have to delegate and really have yourself or members of your team helping you stay on top of that. And then training the staff as needed, right? One other key area of the financial pillar that we always talk a lot about is strategic pricing, and when you think about how you price your funeral home or cemetery, we use the word strategic on purpose. That's intentional because, the good old days of just on the funeral home raising your service fee $50 to $100, maybe increasing your caskets $100, maybe in the cemetery just saying let's take Garden of Gethsemane and move the prices up 150 per grave and call it a day. They don't really work very well anymore, right? You need to be strategic. First, you need to really, really understand what your competitor is doing, right? In the funeral world, we got the FTC, so you can find out exactly what your competitor is doing. And I'm not suggesting that you take that information and try to chase them or match them or come in 100 over on, or but first of all, just understand what they're doing in the marketplace, and do a comparative analysis. You might notice that one firm is significantly lower than you. That may cause you some angst, but then when you take a step back and you look at your market share and realize that they're only serving 10% of the market, you can say, okay, well, let's just take that into account. Let's not let that scare us into a strategy that we're not comfortable with. You want to assess your call average, and this applies to the cemetery as well. When I think about assessing the competitor in the cemetery space, I would definitely look at their entry-level pricing, right? Understand when a family calls or walks in, what's being told to them is an entry-level grave or an entry-level cremation spot or niche, right? And what we've seen a lot of clients have a lot of success with is service packages. And I would put a big cautionary comment here is that You don't want a service package where you have everything in the kitchen sink in there, because then it does feel to the consumer, I believe, a little overwhelming, a little bit like you're trying to push too much on them. At Johnson Consulting, we're huge believers in just a simplified service package. And we can help you develop those for your funeral homes as well as your cemeteries, make it convenient, maybe build in a little bit of a discount to the family. We're all, as consumers, used to purchasing things that are in packages, right? So if you're smart about it, you can make an impact. Often when we work with our clients and help them strategically reprice their funeral home or cemetery, many times, and I could give you lots of examples where we actually don't raise any line item price. We just simply package things together, and then there's a consistent delivery by the funeral director or the family service counselor, right? Then there's no kind of gray area as to what a cremation or memorial service looks like, or what we expect to have on a contract for a full cemetery grave sale or mausoleum crib sale or whatnot. So service packages can make a huge impact for you. In conclusion, I'll leave you with these two kind of thoughts. Number one, be intentional. I said it earlier, you want to play offense. Again, in today's competitive environment, you need to be intentional, because if you're not, that's the only way you can retain and grow your call volume or your interments, your revenues. Being intentional also helps you retain your staff, right? And just really even thinking about how you keep them back in that workplace environment, performing at the highest level. And by being intentional too, we got to stay on top of the technology curve, right? And what's happening out there in the marketplace. Back to that video I played about Generation CX. The consumer today is completely different than the consumers of the past. And what are we doing from our digital marketing to our website? The list goes on and on and on. And then finally, what I'm a huge believer in, and all of us at Johnson are, is the power of accountability, right? Find an accountability partner. Maybe it's us at Johnson, right? And we meet with you monthly or quarterly, and we hold you accountable to your performance. Maybe it's just a mentor or it's a friend. Whoever it is, we want each of you on this call to be successful. Find somebody that will hold you accountable, because what you'll find is if you're being held accountable, you will perform at the very highest levels, because you know that accountability meeting's coming. You want to make sure you've achieved what you set out to achieve. And if you haven't, you want to make kind of corrective plans to adjust along the way. So as we think about 2020, that's certainly something to keep in mind as to how you can get off on the right foot. So Phoebe, we'll open it up for some Q&A and see if there's some folks that have some questions for us before we wrap up.
Great, thank you so much, Larry. Yeah, let's get into some of the questions that were asked. So first question is, we receive countless thank you cards and hugs after services and believe we are doing a very good job. How can we assess the performance of each arranger and know which ones do a better job than others?
Oh, that's a really good question, because if you think about it, if I was to meet you one-on-one at a convention or somewhere along the way, and I would ask you, what's your level of customer service? How good are you at your funeral home or cemetery? If you're not measuring it, you probably would have a hard time giving me an answer other than families love us, we get lots of cards in the mails, we get hugged at the end of the service, right? Our strong recommendation on that, that's a great question, is to send out surveys. Survey your families and get really good feedback. We find that at Johnson, generally speaking, about 30% of families, sometimes even more, will return the survey, which is phenomenal. If you talk to the guys at JD Power and such, hotel industry, cars, restaurants, they're scratching 3 to 5%. 7 or 8 is a huge return rate. So families want to tell you how the experience is. And with Johnson Consulting, when we use our software that's called Performance Tracker, it allows you to run all kinds of reports. You can see if you have multiple firms, maybe some firms are performing at higher levels. But to that question, that was good with PB, is that you could then drill down and look at each arranger. And what I find too is that if you have a high performer, back to there's no greater unequal than equal treatments and unequals, take care of him or her. Maybe that's a bonus, maybe that's some special time off. And if you have somebody that's not performing at that level, address it, because that person is a representation of your company when they interact with the families.
Awesome, that's great. So next question is, you mentioned that service aptitude is not innate. Do you have suggestions of how to increase my staff's service aptitude?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I'll relate this to a story I read in a book that resonates for me. I've got several children, and one of them is my son, Noah. And let's talk about service aptitude for a second. If you hired my son, Noah, to work at, let's say it's your funeral home, and his job is simply to greet people at the front door and show them into the firm. I can promise you this. I know my son, he'd show up on time, he'd be polite. But at the end of his first day as the manager or the owner, you'd probably have to pull him aside and say, hey, listen, Noah, tomorrow when you come in, you really need to pull your pants all the way up, tighten that belt. And phrases like, hey, dude, are probably not the best way to greet people. So I relate that story back to service aptitude, as it really all comes back to training, right? At Johnson, we have an incredible program called our Customer Experience Revolution Workshop. And that's where some of those little points I touched on briefly, that's where we help our clients create vision statements and the pillars of how to deliver that, create those service standards, make sure every family, every time, it receives the experience that you can expect. Again, think about those world-class companies. You better believe that the Ritz-Carlton has done this, right? When you walk into the Ritz-Carlton, you are always greeted a certain way. The whole experience is handled consistently, whether you're in Florida or LA or wherever, right? So I'm a huge believer, and we are at Johnson, that you want to document and put those service standards together. And then again, just training. Companies that are world-class, they see training not as an expense, they see it as an investment, right? I met a gentleman who started a funeral home with a partner in LA who worked at Disney for 7 years. Disneyland's just down the road there in Anaheim. And I said, hey, I got to ask you, tell me about training at Disney. I've just always been curious, because for those of us that have been to Disney, it's just class act, right? Everybody's professional and sweet, and you ask them where the restroom is, they don't point, they escort you. And he said, listen, training is just a way of life with Disney. It's not seen as a negative. We don't dread it. The company doesn't, it's not just a knee jerk, hey, we need to train people on something. So I would challenge you, when you think about service aptitude in that question, is you need to set the bar that this is our way of performing it, and then train your staff. That would definitely be our recommendation.
Those are some great points, Larry. Thank you. Next question is, if I'm honest, we have one employee that is a continued challenge. The problem is he has been with the firm for over 25 years. What should I do?
Oh man, this is a hard one, and I've been there in that role where you have to scratch your head and say, what do we do, right? I would challenge whoever wrote that question. I would challenge you to think like this. You really have an obligation, not only to yourself, but to the rest of your team, right? Because all of those other employees that you have, they interact with this person, and if you think about that, your inaction, the fact that you are not addressing perhaps a bad attitude or breaking company rules or coming in late or whatever it is this person's doing, you're sending a message to the rest of the team, right? So really what you want to do is you want to do what not all of us love to do, is sit them down, right? Talk to them, be very, very specific. Hey, employee, this is where I need your behavior to change. And write it down, put it in a little recap memo, and then hold them accountable, whether it's showing up on time or whether it's saying things inappropriately or whatever might be going on with this employee. The hard part is having that meeting. Sometimes the harder part, though, is the follow-up. I go back to my comment about accountability. Make a plan to meet with that employee, whether it needs to be once a week or twice a month or no more than monthly. I wouldn't wait any longer than monthly. And work with them. Tell them that your goal is for them to improve their performance and be a contributor to your team. If they don't continuously improve when you're meeting with them and holding them accountable, then you've got to have some more stern discussions, right? And as I think I mentioned earlier, you may have to make the very hard decision to let somebody go. And nobody on this call, I'm sure, likes to do that. But sometimes it's the very best thing you can do for your company.
Great points. Next question we have is, how do I know if my AR is good or bad? What are you seeing these days as far as payment terms and policies?
Yeah, a good question. Here's what I've always been perplexed by. It seems like cemeteries for at-need cemetery contracts have always been much, much better at this than funeral homes. I've never understood that why, as to why. But But really what I'm seeing out there and what we're seeing at Johnson is that the funeral homes as well as cemeteries are at need, they're requiring the payment to be made by the day of the service. You know, the old days, and I'm now old enough to say I was a part of this, we used to say, I'll drop a check by next week, or, oh, the estate's going to settle, no problem, give me a call when it's wrapped up. And if any of you on this call has ever waited for an estate to settle, sometimes that could be 18 months to 2 years. So really what we're seeing is folks, you know, hey, we need to get paid by the day of the service. Some folks are even a little more assertive and maybe want to be paid the day before. You know, certainly insurance assignments are still being accepted. But more and more frequently, we're seeing that clients will, they'll charge that 2 or 3% to process that insurance claim through a third party so that they can be paid a little bit quicker. We all know this, have heard the stories of that, you know, the next of kin got the death certificate and filed it on the side and didn't tell us, took the insurance money, and then we don't get paid and things like that. So what you want to do is look at how much accounts receivable you have out there. And you also want to assess, there's a little metric called days sales outstanding, DSOs, which is just kind of an average calculation of, on average, how many days does it take you to collect. And really you should be shooting to be at least 15 days or less. And the only reason I'm not saying 3 or less is because you probably do want to accept some insurance assignments through a third party. So like anything, if you don't address this and stay on top of accounts receivable every single week, it can really get out of hand. And then it's almost insurmountable. I mean, Harvard Business Review will say once you get to 60, 90, 120 days, the likelihood of collection and then the kind of the soft costs of you just spending the time, effort, and all that, chasing that is just, it's ridiculous. So have a policy and be consistent with it would be our thoughts on that.
Very good. Excellent. Next question we have is, as busy as funeral homes can be, how can regular staff meetings happen?
Well, I'd answer that with one word: discipline. I would challenge anybody on this call, as big as your firm might be, staff meetings can happen. Are they easy? No. Will 100% of everybody be at every meeting? Of course not. We're in the funeral and cemetery profession. But you want to be relentless. I mentioned those huddles. Maybe this question comes from that slide. You know, having that morning huddle, just, hey, here's where we're going, go. That's powerful. And then having those regular staff meetings, you know, and your team members, your employees, they want to have a voice. They want to sit at the table. They want to hear that you have a strategy for 2020, what that includes. They want to know if we're going to do a remodel this year or build more cemetery inventory. All those things can be really fleshed out. So I would just say, have discipline and just make it happen. Definitely collaborate. You know, you as the leader, manager, owner, you might need to run them for a while, but then begin to collaborate, get other people to run them, because at a certain point, they should take on a life of their own. And if you take a little bit time off or you're sick or something, they should still continue to happen. So I would do them. I think I mentioned before, you know, if you've got multiple rooftops, have everybody dial into a conference line. I mean, there's so much that can be done. I was very privileged to be working in Chicago for about 10 years. Actually right at 10 years. And we had 25 funeral homes and 20 cemeteries. And for a period of time, we needed to huddle up with the manager of every funeral home every morning because of some challenges we had going on in the marketplace. And you might think, well, how are you going to do that? You got, you know, they're all over, they're western suburbs, north side. Well, we got on a call and we decided to do it even earlier than 8 o'clock. We did it at 7 or 7:15, I forget. But it just sort of, we all got on the same page. So-and-so said he could send a staff member a vehicle over here and vice versa. It just helps you get your day going. And really the same applies in the cemetery. Hey, don't forget, we have a wheelchair next to kin coming. You know, can we get some plywood down to make sure that's a smooth, you know, arrival at the cemetery? Hey, don't forget, this family's got several elderly folks, and we want to, instead of our standard, you know, 6 or 8 or 12 chairs, we want to put out 20. Those little details, it might be documented, it might be on your whiteboard or whatever, but having that quick huddle in the morning really can help make that service be delivered at the best level possible, for sure.
Some great points. Thank you, Larry. We have one more question for today. That is, like most firms, our cremation rate continues to increase, eroding our total revenues, making it more difficult for us to cover our costs. What are you seeing in the industry? Are there firms doing some innovative things to overcome this?
Wow, I wish I had the silver bullet, you know, the perfect answer. That's been a wave that we've all been riding. That's been a tough one. Maybe it's not a wave. Maybe it's more of an uphill battle, right? On the funeral side, I would say getting really strategic with service packages, looking for some ancillary items without it turning into, just offering the family 20 different things that you might want to buy merchandise wise. But really those service packages has helped. Pre-need helps, right? Because you're securing that market share. You're going to keep the call. So really just looking at service packages, finding some innovative, ancillary items that can be presented as well, and holding your team accountable, right? You might find, let's say you have a firm and you've got 4 funeral directors. I'll talk funeral for a second, then hit on cemetery. And let's say 3 of them are pretty consistent with a cremation family, and 1 is just not that great. His or her average sale is, $700 less or some ridiculous number, right? That gives you an opportunity as an owner to make some decisions. Number one, does that person need more training? That's probably rhetorical, and the answer we all know is yes. But if you had a choice and a family called you today after this webinar, and you could put one of your top performers as opposed to this person in front of the family, you might want to think about that. So always looking at who's got kind of an expertise or a talent. And on the cemetery side, the old days of, hey, we've got it, and we've got some niches, and I guess you could bury the urn. You really need to be innovative. You need to have a cremation garden and have a number of different options there. And you also want to think about kind of that low entry price point on the cemetery side when it comes to cremation. It's so common, we all see it, right? Mom or dad or grandpa, they take the urn home and just, think about it or whatever. Maybe you have a very low entry level. Maybe you install an ossuary for your cremation garden, and maybe you offer the ossuary for free if they select a memorial plaque, assuming your state laws allows for that sort of an agreement. Be innovative, because the moment you at least get that, let's say you did a program like that where you allowed them to place their loved one in an ossuary for free, you've secured the heritage of that family in your cemetery. And now, as future family members have a death, you most likely are going to retain them as additional heritage, owners in the cemetery. So, again, no silver bullet on that question. It's a tough one, but you certainly can't just bury your head in the sand. You've got to come up. You got to have strategies. Jump on the phone with us or somebody that can be a sounding board to give you some ideas to really continue to work hard to try to hang on to the revenues for sure. So.
That's excellent. Well, we want to thank you, Larry, for such a great discussion, for all your expertise, and thank you everyone for joining. Be on the lookout for info on our next webinar, where Disrupt Media's Ryan Thogmartin and Jake Johnson will be discussing Jake's latest book, Staying Alive in the Funeral and Cemetery Profession. Again, thanks so much, and we hope you have a great Wednesday.
Thank you. Bye-bye.